London has survived fire. It has survived plague. It has endured the steady, suffocating blanket of industrial soot. But buried deep within the parish records and forgotten newspapers of the early 19th century is a disaster so absurd, so entirely surreal, that history has spent over 200 years trying to pass it off as a dark comedy. Imagine the sound. It is not the low rumble of an earthquake. It is not the roar of a bursting river dam. It is a sharp, metallic crack. Then another. Then an explosion that shatters the late afternoon quiet, followed by a rushing, foaming wall of absolute darkness sweeping through the tight, twisting alleys of the city. It was a flood, but it was not water. It was 320,000 gallons of dark, heavy, intoxicating liquid. It was a tsunami of beer. And while the history books have neatly filed this away as a bizarre accident, a freak occurrence of Victorian-era industry, the faded ink on the coroner's report tells a slightly different story. A story of ignored warnings, impossible physics, and a sudden, highly convenient silence. To understand the sheer scale of this disaster, you have to understand where it happened. The date is October 17, 1814. The location is the Meux and Company Horseshoe Brewery, situated at the edge of St Giles in the Fields. Today, the West End of London is a place of theatres, bright lights, and expensive real estate. But in 1814, St Giles was a rookery. It was an overcrowded, decaying maze of slum housing, packed with destitute families, Irish immigrants, and the absolute poorest of London's working class. The streets were barely wide enough for a cart. Entire families lived in damp, lightless cellars beneath the cobblestones. Looming over this desperate poverty was the Horseshoe Brewery. It was an industrial titan, a massive complex of brick and wood that pumped out London's most popular drink, a dark, heavy beer known as porter. Inside the brewery sat the pride of the Meux Company. It was a wooden fermentation vat of monstrous proportions. It stood 22 feet high. It was held together by massive iron hoops, some weighing up to 700 pounds each. Inside this towering wooden silo sat over 1 million pints of fermenting porter, resting right up against the brick wall that separated the factory from the crowded slum of New Street. The official story tells us that on that crisp October afternoon, the vat simply failed. The iron snapped. The wood gave way. The beer rushed out, claiming the lives of 8 innocent people in a tragic, unforeseeable act of nature. But when you look closer at the timeline, at the people involved, and at the immediate aftermath, a cold question begins to rise from the archives. Was this truly an unforeseeable accident? Or was it the inevitable, deadly result of corporate hubris, where the warnings were loud, clear, and deliberately ignored? We know the official story. But why does the evidence feel so carefully curated? According to the mainstream historical record, the disaster of the London beer flood was nothing more than a mechanical failure, a tragic, unavoidable malfunction of early industrial engineering. The accepted narrative relies heavily on the testimony of a single man. His name was George Crick. He was the storehouse clerk at the Meux and Company Brewery, a man whose job it was to monitor the massive vats. The official timeline states that at around 4:30 in the afternoon on October 17th, Crick was making his usual rounds. He noticed that one of the massive iron hoops binding the great vat had slipped. It had completely snapped off and fallen to the floor. According to the established record, Crick did exactly what he was supposed to do. He went to his superior. He informed one of the brewery partners about the broken hoop. The partner, recognizing that this was a common occurrence with wooden vats of this size, told Crick not to panic. He instructed the clerk to write a letter to the brewery's cooper, the man responsible for maintaining the barrels, and ask him to come and fix it at his earliest convenience. Crick followed orders. He wrote the letter, but before the letter could even be sent, the unthinkable happened. At exactly 5:30 in the evening, 1 hour after the first hoop snapped, the vat violently ruptured. The official explanation points to the immense internal pressure of the fermenting porter. Without the support of the broken hoop, the remaining iron bands simply could not hold the weight. They gave way in a catastrophic chain reaction. The force of the explosion was so immense that it shattered the back wall of the brewery. It launched a shockwave that destroyed neighboring vats, adding tens of thousands of gallons to the surge. A tidal wave of dark beer, estimated to be 15 feet high, crashed into the narrow alleys of St Giles. It pulverized 2 houses on New Street instantly. It smashed through the wall of the Tavistock Arms pub, trapping the teenage barmaid in the rubble. It poured into the subterranean cellars where families were having their tea, drowning them in total darkness. The inquest was held a mere 2 days later. The coroner, a man named George Hodgson, listened to the testimony. He reviewed the devastation, and he quickly delivered a verdict that absolved the Meux Brewery of all wrongdoing. The official ruling was casualty, an act of God. No one was to blame. It was a tragedy of physics, a sad day for the city, and nothing more. The history books accepted the verdict, and the story slowly transitioned from a horrific disaster into a quirky piece of historical trivia. But when we step away from the coroner's swift conclusion and actually look at the structural realities of the Meux Brewery, the foundation of this official story begins to rot. The first crack in the official narrative comes from George Crick himself, or rather, from what George Crick's testimony implies about the culture inside the brewery. Let us look closely at the broken hoop. The official story claims that hoop snapping was a common occurrence, something that happened often enough that it did not warrant an emergency response. But we are not talking about a standard beer barrel. We are talking about a vat that held over 300,000 gallons of liquid. The iron hoops binding this specific vat weighed hundreds of pounds. The sheer tensile strength required to snap an iron band of that thickness is astronomical. For a hoop of that size to break, the pressure inside the vat had to be building for days, if not weeks. Wood speaks before it breaks. It groans. It warps. It leaks. The idea that a 22-foot-tall structure holding millions of pounds of liquid showed absolutely no signs of distress until an hour before it exploded defies the basic laws of engineering. And then there is the response of the brewery partner. When Crick reported the broken hoop, he noted that the vat was completely full. It was filled to the absolute brim. The standard operating procedure for any cooper or brewer of the era, when faced with a structural compromise, was to immediately relieve the pressure. You open a valve. You drain some of the liquid. You lessen the load on the remaining wood. They did not do this. Instead, the partner told Crick to write a letter. He did not send a boy running through the streets to fetch the blacksmith. He did not order the workers to drain the porter. He told a clerk to draft a piece of correspondence. Why the lack of urgency? Why leave a million pints of fermenting liquid pressing against compromised wood, right next to a brick wall that separated the factory from a densely populated slum? Furthermore, let us examine the chain reaction. The official inquest states that the bursting of the great vat caused the surrounding vats to shatter. But how? These were incredibly robust structures. For a wave of liquid to shatter neighboring vats of equal thickness, the initial explosion must have carried the force of a modern bomb. Was the wood already rotten? Were the other vats equally compromised? The coroner never asked these questions. He never ordered an independent inspection of the surviving vats. He simply took the brewery's word that it was a spontaneous, unexplainable event. The curiosity gap here is massive. We have a highly profitable corporation, a catastrophic failure of heavy industry, a complete lack of standard safety protocols, and a legal system that looked the other way in exactly 48 hours. To understand why, we have to look away from the broken iron and look toward the money. In 1814, London was in the grip of the Porter Wars. Brewing was no longer a small, local trade. It was a massive, fiercely competitive, industrialized monopoly. A handful of massive brewing companies, including Whitbread, Truman, and Meux, dominated the city. And they were engaged in a bitter, highly public rivalry. The battleground was not just the taste of the beer. It was the size of the vats. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, giant brewing vats became symbols of corporate dominance. They were the skyscrapers of their day. Brewers would host extravagant dinner parties inside the empty vats before filling them, just to prove to the press how massive they were. It was a spectacular display of hubris. Meux and Company had built their great vat specifically to outsize their rivals. It was a vanity project, but vanity projects, pushed to the absolute limits of early 19th century engineering, carry a heavy risk. The records showed that the Meux brewery was expanding rapidly, perhaps too rapidly. They were pushing their equipment to the breaking point to meet the endless demand for porter. Every gallon of space inside that vat represented raw profit. To drain the vat, even partially, to relieve the pressure of a broken hoop, would mean pouring money down the drain. It would mean halting fermentation. It would mean falling behind the competition. Is it possible that the brewery partner did not ignore the broken hoop out of ignorance, but out of greed? Did they gamble the structural integrity of the vat against the financial loss of draining it, betting that the remaining iron would hold just long enough for the cooper to arrive the next day? And when that gamble failed, the poorest citizens of London paid the price. Let us look at the victims. The names recorded in the archives are a heartbreaking reflection of the St Giles slum. There was Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old girl who worked as a servant at the Richard Hawes pub. She was outside in the courtyard, simply washing pots at the pump, when the brick wall of the brewery exploded outward, burying her instantly. There was Mary Banfield and her young daughter Hannah. They were having tea in their ground floor room on New Street when the wave tore the front of their house off. Perhaps the most tragic detail of all occurred in a damp cellar beneath the street. A family was holding a traditional Irish wake for a 2-year-old boy who had died the day before. The mourners were gathered in the cramped, underground room. When the tsunami of porter hit the street, it immediately flooded down the cellar steps. The heavy liquid filled the room in seconds, leaving no air and no escape. 5 people drowned in that single room. These were not people with the means to hire lawyers. They were not people who could demand a thorough investigation. They were the invisible workforce of the city, living in the shadow of a roaring industrial machine. For decades, a myth circulated that the residents of St Giles ran into the streets with pots and pans to drink the spilled beer, leading to riots and mass drunkenness. Some historical accounts even claim people died of alcohol poisoning in the aftermath. But investigative historians digging into the actual records of 1814 have found zero evidence of this. It is a myth. It is a cruel fabrication designed to mock the poor of St Giles, painting them as drunken opportunists rather than the victims of a horrifying industrial collapse. The real reports from the day describe a scene of desperate rescue, of neighbors digging through shattered bricks and suffocating sludge with their bare hands to find the missing. The myth of the drunken riot served a very specific purpose. It distracted the public from the reality of the negligence. When you piece together the extreme competition of the Porter Wars, the impossible physics of a sudden vat collapse, and the creation of myths to mock the victims, a darker picture begins to emerge. We must ask the uncomfortable questions. Is it possible that the disaster at the Meux Brewery was not an accident at all? There is a theory, whispered among industrial historians, that the great vat was already structurally condemned. Wood rots, iron rusts. The Meux Company had been using these massive vats for years, subjecting them to intense internal pressure and highly acidic liquids. What if the brewery leadership knew the vat was failing? Replacing a 22-foot vat would cost a fortune. It would halt production for months. But if the vat were to suffer a catastrophic failure, an act of God, the financial equation changes entirely. Consider the excise tax. In 1814, the British government heavily taxed the production of beer. Meux and Company had already paid the massive taxes on the hundreds of thousands of gallons sitting in that vat. If they voluntarily drained the beer to fix a leak, they lost the beer and the tax money. But if the beer was destroyed in an unavoidable natural disaster, they could petition the government for a refund. And that is exactly what happened. Following the disaster, Meux and Company claimed that they faced complete financial ruin. They lost the beer, they lost the vats, and they lost the building. They drafted a desperate petition to the British Parliament, begging for relief. The government listened. Parliament granted the Meux Brewery a massive rebate on the excise taxes they had paid on the spilled beer. The amount refunded was staggering, enough to save the company from bankruptcy. Is it possible that a calculated decision was made on the afternoon of October 17th? A decision to let the vat strain until it broke, assuming it would just be a messy spill in the courtyard, allowing them to claim the tax rebate? Did they simply miscalculate the sheer explosive power of the rupture, entirely underestimating the deadly wave that would obliterate New Street? We cannot say for certain, but the pattern of corporate behavior, the ignored warnings, the rapid legal clearance, and the immediate pivot to securing government bailouts feels chillingly modern. There is also the question of sabotage. In the cutthroat era of the Porter Wars, breweries employed spies. They sought any advantage over their rivals. Could someone have intentionally weakened the iron bands? Could a rival have paid a worker to strike a rusted hoop with a heavy hammer in the dead of night? While sabotage is a compelling theory, it requires a level of malice that is hard to prove. The theory of gross, calculated negligence, fueled by greed and the promise of tax loopholes, fits the surviving evidence far too perfectly. The most damning piece of this historical puzzle is not what is in the records. It is how fast the records were closed. Let us return to the coroner, George Hodgson. 8 people lay dead. A massive factory had exploded into a residential neighborhood. Homes were destroyed. In any thorough legal system, an investigation of this magnitude requires time. It requires structural engineers to examine the wood. It requires metallurgists to examine the iron hoops. It requires interrogations of the entire chain of command at the brewery, not just the word of one clerk. Hodgson opened the inquest on October 19th, 2 days after the flood. He gathered the jury at a local workhouse. They viewed the bodies. They listened to George Crick recount his story of the broken hoop and the unsent letter. They listened to the brewery partners express their deep sorrow. And then, before the week was even over, the jury delivered their verdict. Casualty. Act of God. The speed of this verdict is breathtaking. By ruling it an act of God, the coroner legally shielded the Meux Brewery from any liability. The families of the dead could not sue for damages. The residents whose homes were crushed could not demand compensation from the wealthy brewers. The law explicitly stated that the Meux family owed nothing to the people of St Giles. The victims were buried in a mass grave at St Giles Church. The brewery paid for a few modest funeral expenses, a public relations gesture that cost them pennies, and then quietly went back to the business of making beer. The voices of the victims' families are entirely absent from the historical record. They were not called to testify. They were not interviewed by the major papers. They were poor, they were Irish, and in the eyes of the Victorian industrial machine, they were entirely disposable. The Meux Brewery, bolstered by their massive government tax refund, rebuilt the shattered wall. They continued to brew porter. They grew richer. They remained in operation on that exact site for another 100 years, finally closing down in 1921. The site of the disaster, the slums of New Street, were eventually swept away by modernization. Today, the Dominion Theatre stands over the ground where the vat exploded. The site of the disaster, the slums of New Street, were eventually swept away by modernization. Today, the Dominion Theatre stands over the ground where the vat exploded. But more accurately, it is written by the survivors who can afford to buy the ink. The London beer flood of 1814 has been handed down to us as a cartoonish anomaly, a strange, quirky event to be chuckled at in pub trivia games. But when you strip away the bizarre nature of the liquid, what remains is a stark, terrifying blueprint of industrial disaster. It is the story of infrastructure, pushed beyond its limits for the sake of profit. It is the story of workers who saw the warnings and were told to look the other way. It is the story of a legal system that protected the wealthy architects of the disaster, while burying the poor victims in silence. We look back at the broken iron hoops and the shattered brick walls, and we have to wonder, was the coroner really satisfied that an immense iron band snapping on a massive, pressurized silo was simply an unpredictable act of nature? Did the partners of the Meux Brewery truly believe their massive vat was safe? Or did they calculate the worth of the people living on the other side of the wall and decide it was a risk worth taking? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of tragic, unavoidable accidents in an era before safety regulations existed. Or maybe the people who lived through it, the ones who heard the wood groaning for days, saw something we no longer recognize. The truth is buried somewhere beneath the pavement of the West End. But the next time you hear a story of a bizarre, unexplainable historical accident, ask yourself, who benefited from the explanation? And who was left paying the price?